Regulations and sense of place, the cross-cultural conversion of Italian and American cheese.
As you said, my name is Kaitlyn Stewart, Katie, and I'm here to talk about cheese. So, stemming from the ideas of other environmental and food anthropologists, my project is a cross-cultural comparison between a goat cheese farmstead in Parma, Idaho, and a farmstead in Calabria, Italy. Similarities and differences between the two provide insight into the cultural context in which artisanal cheesemakers are attempting to make, distribute, and market their cheese. In order to do this, I worked part-time for 5 months on the farm in Parma, and lived for 3 months at the farm in Italy, participating in all aspects of daily life in cheesemaking, much of which included learning to be a proper Italian wife, according to their traditions, of course, learning to clean and cook with Nonna Maria, who I lived with. My project focuses on 3 variables that are integral in the culture of cheesemaking: regulations, sense of place, and food ideology. These 3 variables are applied to the cheesemaking process as a whole, from start to finish. When I say cheesemaking process, I don't mean the process of making the cheese itself, but the process by which cheese is produced, starting with the land. For this presentation, I break this process down into 3 definitive aspects of the process: the cheese, the animals, and the land, on each of the 2 farms where I conducted my research. The first is Rolling Stone Shed, which is located in Parma, Idaho, over there. Idaho has a history of agriculture, and in the last century, dairy industry has flourished, and it is now actually 3rd behind Wisconsin and California. So the owners, Karen and Chuck Evans, moved back to Idaho in the 80s to Chuck's boyhood farm to do pottery and art. But they realized that, you can't make any money in southern Idaho doing art, so they decided to make cheese instead. So they primarily make European-style cheeses, mostly French, and they definitely adhere to the idea that cheese is an art. Karen says that you eat with your eyes. So they had to change their cheese according to American taste. Since they started back in the 80s, she said they had to deal with Velveeta consumers, and so they made mostly just plain Chev. They've changed a little bit over the years, but they're kind of stuck in what they've been doing, and she wants to make more interesting cheeses in the future. Right now, she ships her cheeses to bigger cities where artisanal markets are more available, mostly like Portland and Seattle, but also across the country to New York. She has to pasteurize all of her milk unless the cheese is being aged over 6 months, according to the USDA. And she said that she can make the exact same style of cheese, do the process the exact same way, but the cheese won't taste as good as it would in Europe because of the pasteurization laws. She also says that you can't have true quality control with outside milk. And so that is why they do their process as a farmstead. They raise all their goats there on the farm, and then they use that milk. Which leads us to the goats. She's very proud of her goats. They're a Saanen breed, and she has to cull the herd every month in order to keep the herd productive. And she actually, we had to do this last year when I was working there, and myself and the other worker that was there had to load them up into the trailer to bring them to the auction. And Karen could not be a part of this because she felt like she was turning her back on her friends because she's had some of these goats for 10 years. And so she thinks of them as friends, but she realizes that they are her livelihood, and so she just couldn't be a part of it, but she said she has to do it. It's either them or me, she said. They also breed them to be scorecard perfect, as if they were to be shown. And so it relies on different things such as the udder shape, how the udder hangs, the width of the chest. And so, of course, Karen taught me this by walking me down the milk line and having me feel each udder. So definitely hands-on experience. So the last thing that she talks about is that they are foragers. She doesn't like to pen her goats because they're healthier if they're out in the pastures foraging for their food and having to sniff around to find it themselves, which brings us to the land. Karen recognizes that the milk changes with the seasons according to what the goats are foraging for and what they are eating because of the seasons. So she pairs her cheeses to it. In the spring, it's more of the fresh cheese, just the plain Chev because it's fattier and more delicious. And in the fall, she does something called the late harvest, where she puts grapes left over from winemaking in the region to pair with the tanginess. She also names her cheeses for the area landmark, which is the Snake River. So she has 3 new cheeses that are called Snake River Mist, White River Rapids, and the Canyon Run. She also has very little grazing management technique, she says, and she says she doesn't really need it. They produce great milk without it. So she waters the fields every once in a while, but not very much, and she doesn't plant anything. She just lets weeds grow, and they eat, and they produce great milk. So now we move to Italy, to the southern region of Calabria, to a little town called Morano Calabro. The farm is named Dolci Pascoli, which in Italian means sweet pastures. So Calabria and the rest of southern Italy is known for their agriculture as well, and they're also a fairly poor region because they rely mainly on agriculture. So the Barletta family is who I stayed with, and they have been doing agriculture in this area and on this same land for about 2,000 years. But in the 2000s, the brothers Giuseppe and Alberto realized that they needed to do some modern form of work. So they decided to make their lifestyle of raising goats and sheep into some kind of livelihood, and they started Dolci Pascoli. And so something to understand is that Italy is very regional. They only joined together as a country in the late 1800s, and so people don't really recognize themselves as Italian, but especially in this region, they saw themselves as Moranese, which was from this area of Morano. And they even spoke some dialect, or only dialects to each other, which is some kind of mixture between Italian, Spanish, and something else that is really hard to understand. It's a completely different language than Italian. So when they make their cheese, that translates into it as well. They make very traditional cheeses for this area. They make pecorino, which is sheep cheese, caprino, which is a goat's cheese, and then one called felciata, which is a very traditional one that is only made in Morano, and it's a fresh cheese, and also the grutazzo, which is also only made there because of the specific bacteria that is in the air and the land. And they are all named di Morano, or of Morano. They sell only their cheeses in Calabria. They don't export anywhere else. And they don't pasteurize most of their cheeses because of the bacteria that is present. They want to use it. But they do pasteurize some of them just for sanitation reasons. As I was saying, the grutazzo before is one that's kind of like brie. It has the outside that's really moldy and the inside that's really creamy. It's one of the ones that are not pasteurized because of the bacteria that is present in the air and in the foliage that the animals eat, and so they don't pasteurize that one at all. So now we go to the animals. The animals are pasture-raised on their 1,000 hectares, or 2,400-ish acres. And Giuseppe says that they don't lead them around or anything. They're not stupid. They know where to go to find their food because they are a mixed breed. They're a native species of goat and sheep, which are also bred with some milkers. They're also meat animals. So they sell their meat in the macelleria in the local village. And they also eat it at home very frequently, which was something that me, as an animal lover from the U.S., had a very hard time with when they brought the head of the goat out of the pot, stuck it on the table, and was like, "Here, pick your meat off, it's mine." Which brings us now to the land. Similar to the U.S. farm, they have very little grazing management. They go up and down the mountains according to the seasons. The shepherds just kind of follow behind them to make sure they don't get eaten by any wolves and bring them back at night to be milked. They are certified organic by the EU, and not because they wanted to, join the fad of organic, but Giuseppe says because they've never not been organic. They've always done it this way. Why change it? They also raise all their own hay on their property for the sheep during the winter. So, how do these two compare side by side? First, we'll start with the similarities. There's definitely a history of agriculture in both regions. They pasture-raise their animals. The cheeses are named for the place, and they respect the animals. However, they are very different in many ways. First, the one in Idaho ships their cheeses fairly far distances, as far as New York, whereas in Italy it stays within the region. The breeds of the animal are different. The one in Idaho is obviously not a native breed, whereas the one in Calabria is a mixture. Pasteurization is a huge thing because they don't have to pasteurize in Italy, but they do some of them, and the one in Idaho does have to, but she would rather not. Government funding, which I will talk a little bit more about later. The one in Italy receives a little bit from the EU. The one in Idaho receives none. The animal raising is much more hands-on in Idaho. They want to domesticate the animals to make sure that they're used to humans so that they're easier to milk, whereas in Italy they're much more just hands-off, let them wander. And eating the animals, of course, since Karen thinks of the animals as her friends, she's not going to eat her animals. But the people in Calabria, even though they respect the animals, they eat them. And then the cheese caves, which I will talk a little bit more later, but Karen is currently in the process of building a cheese cave to age her cheeses, and Dolce Pascoli ages their cheeses in a temperature and humidity controlled refrigerator. So, how do they fit into the variables I discussed earlier? First, we'll start with the regulations. So, obviously, pasteurization is a huge idea. There is a very big difference between the ideas of cleanliness between like the EU and the US. And so, in the US, we are very afraid of some of the bacteria that are living in the milk for good reasons. Whereas in Italy, you know, they're a little more accepting, and they also want to pasteurize. And then there's also the issue of subsidies. So, like I said before, Karen doesn't receive any money. She says only the big farms with cows do, which is true in Idaho. And at Dolce Pascoli, they receive money from the EU as part of their effort to promote natural farming and biodiversity. Which brings us next to sense of place. One of the big things I noticed as a difference is the human involvement in nature and the sense of belonging in a place. So, in Italy, and especially with this family, their treatment of the animals and the way they name their cheeses shows how the people feel more integrated within their natural environment. Obviously, they've been living there for thousands of years and been doing the same thing for thousands of years, and they pride themselves on the fact that the land has been relatively unchanged. In the US, we definitely have this idea of wilderness. And, you know, there's the place where humans reside and the place where people don't. And so the way she domesticates her animals, the way she names her cheeses, definitely have this romantic idea of nature and preserving it for its aesthetic, but we also want to use it for our benefit and and use it to produce our own products. So there was that idea and naming of cheeses. So which next brings us to food ideology. So there's this huge conflict, and I'm sure you guys have heard it, especially with this whole local organic food movement going on right now. There's a conflict between creating an artistic product for affluent consumers versus products for the masses. And this definitely came up a lot in my research. And it's both an issue of food ideology of the consumer as well as the producer, and whether or not these two match up. And so Karen could make the cheese that consumers want. She could make cheddar, she could make some kind of American-style cheese, but instead she wants to make the European cheeses. She wants to make something that is more interesting, she says, and thus she has to send it elsewhere. Dolce Pascoli can keep all their cheeses in Calabria because that is what people want, and that's what they've been eating for a very long time. So now, what does this all mean? The best explanation is through pictures of how the farms age their cheese. One side is evolution, and one side is revolution. So, on the right is the old cheese cave at Dolce Pascoli, and on the left is the new walk-in refrigerator with temperature and humidity control. At Dolce Pascoli, they have been doing what they do for generations, and not without changes. Though they keep their traditions, they have evolved over the years by adapting to new technologies from the outside. So globalization and industrialization is just one step in their overall story, so have adapted accordingly while maintaining what they consider important in their traditions. At Rolling Stone, they have a much bigger idea of revolution. So they have to adhere to all these modern ideas of cleanliness, and thus they use some modern technology. But they also have this idea that they have to revolt against this dominant industrial food culture, and so they're searching for some kind of food culture in this sense of place and returning to these ancient traditions. So she's taking things from Europe, she's taking things from Italy, and she's trying to do everything by hand and as simply as possible. So rather than building some kind of temperature and humidity controlled fridge, she's trying to build a cave made out of concrete and hay to mimic the caves of the past. So the overall point is not to say that one side is better than the other. Obviously, both of them are working within their own context of history and cultural understandings. But in both reacting to this industrial power, they're opening this dialogue between each other. And so there's all these talks about how wonderful Italy is and how wonderful all these traditions are, and how they've been doing this the same way for thousands and thousands of years, which is only half true. And then there's the story that the Americans are, these awful people who only eat hamburgers and French fries, because I got a lot of that when I was over there. And it's hard to explain, like, that's not all American food is. And so by opening this dialogue, as we both are fighting against this industrial food culture, we can learn a lot from each side, and we can bring everything together. So that's my presentation. Thank you. Questions?
How did you persuade both groups to let you do all of this with them? What was their reaction?
Well, it's pretty easy when you offer to work for free. So that's what I was doing. I was working part-time in both places. And actually, the Italian farm is part of an organization called WOOF, the Worldwide Opportunities at Organic Farms. And so I paid a little money to be a part of this organization. I went through a list of farms, and I chose them, and I said, hey, I'll come work if you let me live there. And they said, yes. So.
Was the one in Idaho certified organic?
No. She, one, she says it's too expensive to go through the whole process. And two, she says she tries to do things naturally, but she still gives her goats like vaccination because she'd rather they were healthy, she says, than organic.
I was just wondering if, I know a lot of farmers have a lot of tension with USDA and like regulation, but I've met a farmer that's just said USDA certified organic ain't worth shit, and I was like, that's just a nice example of how tense that relationship is.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any of that in those Italian farms, or are they a little more freer because it's so traditional?
Well, it's hard to say because they definitely didn't. They didn't say that they had a lot of tension directly to me.
Yeah.
And it was harder. It was easier to see that here. But they also have obviously some more backing from the EU as far as like they give them money every year. So I don't know how difficult it was for them to get certified organic, but it seems like it was pretty easy for them, according to what they said.
This is a crowd from Wisconsin. There's no questions.
Which one's better?
They're very different. It's hard to say which one's better because they're both very different cheeses. Yeah.
Did I hear you correctly say, because in the U.S. She has to pasteurize it for the USDA regulations, and in Italy they don't. They do some of them. Did you say that the American woman she would prefer not to because of the taste, but you said that the Italians do want to pasteurize? Did I hear that?
Yes.
Okay.
She would rather she didn't have to. She likes to pasteurize some of it because she does recognize that there are dangerous bacteria. But she's also like, I wish I didn't have to sometimes because like the flavor is so much better because there's all this bacteria present that makes cheese better. And then in Italy, likewise, we're like, well, we're going to pasteurize some of them because like we don't need to not pasteurize them, and we might as well just make it a little more sanitary. But the ones that they don't have to in order to keep the flavor and the characteristics of the cheese, they didn't. Yes.
So would you say that these folks in Idaho, like you said, were originally artists and adopted this as a big art project, and the people in Italy are actually doing it to pay the bills? Do you see that recognition? This kind of, let's go back to building a cave of concrete and hay, concrete building on a flathead.
Yeah. That's kind of the whole idea is that here in the U.S. everybody's trying to go back to the traditional ways. They're trying to go back in time and do it traditionally, whereas the people in Italy are, I mean, both sides are using it to pay the bills. Both sides are not exactly making a ton of money. I'm just say that, but in Italy, yeah, they're definitely. It's just they're their lifestyle, and that's the way they've been doing it, and they're just going to keep adapting to make it a little more efficient, but still keep their values.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a crowd at the door, so we stop at this one.
So what do these two groups think of each other? And you as the observer had access to both of them. I'm sure you had to explain yourself to both of them. What do they think of each other?
Well, Karen was a huge fan of Italy. She's been there she had the typical, American idea of Italy. It's beautiful and romantic, and they make wonderful cheese, which they do, I'm not gonna lie. And she loves that. The ones in the U.S., I tried to explain, like, what my idea of American food is, and, it's like rustic and whatever, and they're like, you just eat hamburgers and chocolate ice cream all the time, and I'm like, no, I really don't. So it was kind of the typical idea between both of them. So that's kind of why I did this project, was because, like, those guys can learn a lot from each other.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.